crew that said they were coming in, but it's past 2:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is John Midgen. I'm the Executive Director for the North Carolina Police Benevolent Association, and I'm a former Raleigh police officer and been working with PBA for about 25 years. The North Carolina PBA was incorporated in 1988 in North Carolina, and Fayetteville, this area is one of our starting chapters going back to about 1980, latter part 89, or 88 into 89 when we first started membership here. The chapter has recently become more active in getting back into the political process. Ironically, we weren't prepared to get in the middle of this kind of situation. But we have done candidate screenings. We're trying to get more actively involved, and clearly the officers on the street, we believe, have a very legitimate purpose in any kind of political process where they're the first responders, people on the ground, and they are men and women that go out every day risking their lives for people they don't even know. And it is an honorable profession. It's not perfect, but statistically it beats most every other profession in terms of ethics, principle, and responsibility. With that said, this issue came to our attention through our membership, and our major focus right here is not that the City Council cannot certainly look to all kinds of ways to validate what their department is doing, but in the case of getting into a situation where a moratorium or policy or procedure supersedes or sets aside state or federal law, that cannot stand. This is a nation of the rule of law. It is from our founding fathers' process all the way to where we are right now. And if we step outside of that, it's not the issue, the particular issue, it's how we address those issues. And if you take another issue that would be more understandable to other folks, then I think the principle by which the rule of law must be followed is what would be the standard by which we would do this, and not the particular issue or feeling that is presented. With that said, we would very much have liked to have presented this to the City Council. We had asked multiple times to present this to them. They said it was already, they denied our multiple requests to do so, which we think is very unfortunate because we don't think they had enough input from the citizenry, and I think that there should have been more public debate on this issue because it is very important. Anytime you're making any decision that is looking at setting aside the state and federal authority and what our Supreme Court has said for more than 60 years in the validation of a process that officers have used as a legitimate tool of law enforcement, I think that ranks as something that the public ought to have a right to have more debate on and have more input on before the City Council makes a decision. With that said, we invited the council to be here today for this. I don't see anybody here, although we have had a couple of members that have been very supportive and helpful in understanding those principles that I just spoke upon. I have with me here Attorney J. Michael McGinnis, who's one of our attorneys that has worked with us on this matter and on many matters since, how long, Mike? 1990?
1990.
1990. So,
it all started in a press conference when a certain officer was fired from the press conference. We'll leave that out of it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we used to represent members, quite frankly, that were fired for joining the PBA or speaking under First Amendment issues, and we've grown quite a bit, so that we're at least not having our members fired for those kinds of reasons now. And we have developed a process where I must say in this situation we are joined by other leaders in law enforcement, the Sheriff's Association, the North Carolina Association of Chiefs of Police, and others that have joined with us to agree that the position we have taken is solid and is a very lawful one. I also have with me Jerry Schrecker, who's a 30-year veteran law enforcement officer, recently retired from the Fayetteville Police Department. I'm going to have him come up here in a minute. He's going to speak to you about the specifics of this issue and what is going on with the police department as opposed to the feelings that are being presented out there, what is actually transpiring with the department. And we're very honored to have him here as a retired member. He brings a lot to the association in terms of what we're doing with our active service members and on the local, state, and regional basis of PBA. One other thing I'd like to point out, this is not only just a legal issue to us, our membership across the state has been very concerned about this because if this can be done here, where else is it going to be done, and what else are they going to start putting bans on? A moratorium is another word for a ban, and it suppresses officers from their lawful right of duty, and if that occurs, what else is going to happen in terms of stopping them from performing their duties? And one thing I'll point out that I follow from what Chief Bergemine said, that is just the way it is. When I became a police officer, not too long before that, a police officer in Raleigh could go down and get a badge at Hudson Belks and a blue uniform. And they went out on the street and they patrolled for a while until the police department had what they called like a 4-week academy. Most police departments didn't have anything like that. In the early 70s, there was no standard process. We now have standard procedures where officers have to have minimum basic training that is expanded into a statewide process that is validated through a certification process that is overseen by the North Carolina Justice Training Education and Standards Commission, which is overseen through the Department of Justice and our Attorney General. Every police officer must be state certified, or if you will, have a license to practice their profession. They are duty bound by practices under GS 14-230 and other principles that they are required by law, not just to perform their duties, but that they have a duty to perform, not just the ability to perform. And if they are failing to do that, their certifications can be lifted. Whether the departments do anything about it has nothing to do with it. A police officer can lose their livelihood and their license to practice their profession, whether their department steps in to do this or not. So when Chief Burgomeier is talking about obeying an unlawful act or asking other officers or ordering them to obey an unlawful order, he is indeed subject to decertification under 14-230 and other principles of law and policy by the North Carolina Justice Training Education Standards Commission. And so that is yet another dilemma that we're looking at, and we will talk a little bit more in detail about what we're asking through the Attorney General's office to address that as well. Without further ado, I will call on Mr. Schwecker if he would please step up and present his information to you.
I'll go around, guys.
Oh, good, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Good afternoon. My name is Jerry Schrecker. I've served 30 years in law enforcement in total. 6 of those years were with the United States Army Military Police Corps, and the other 24 and a half or so was with the Fayetteville City Police Department. I retired last September the 1st with full retirement. And that I am retired, you can be assured that what I speak today comes from me. Obviously, they can't fire me from retirement anymore, so what you hear from me is what I feel, what's on my mind. I believe the description of certain police behaviors would be helpful. Since I am a retired police officer, I've got more than book sense. In fact, when I was with the police department, a number of those years were spent as a sergeant in the technical services division. I was responsible for database administration, for the data within the city, the data contained within the computers. I had some experience with computers, and that developed, and that led me to that position. I had a direct influence with the crime mapping and the statistic analysis as the database administrator while holding that position. A lot of that criteria with those queries were developed by me and another guy named Bob Payton with the Fayetteville Police Department. First step in this crime analysis is that the crime analysis unit collects all the data generated from the police reports, field interviews, arrest reports, prisoner releases, and a myriad of other data sources that we rely on, that we get from state, federal, etc. This information is mapped to an electronic map of Fayetteville. And in this electronic mapping, that data flows through several other subroutines, which converts it into a visual representation of the crime within the city, in effect developing what we call hotspots, a visual representation of where the crime is committed, where we need to direct our attention. Now I want to point out, race is not one of the factors that is included in these subroutines. I know this for a fact. I'm the one who developed a lot of these subroutines. What it's based on is what we call crimes for service. When it calls for service. When you all call in to the police department, that generates a whole chain of events that goes into the database, and that's where we pull that data from. A lot of things we look at is where did the calls regarding breaking and entering occur? Is there a grouping that shows us to go to this point and patrol more closely because there's a grouping close together and increasing our chances to catch the guys committing the crimes? Same goes for robbery, assaults, rapes, and other crimes reported. This means that the primary factor in the development of crime hotspots is you, the public. And therefore, the generation of crime hotspots is not driven by the police, but it's what drives the police. Years ago, before the police had these technological developments, and I know where I speak of this because I was there before we had computers, you were given a badge, you were given a gun, and you were told go out to your zone and patrol your zone. Your zone was your responsibility. It was considered forbidden to come out of your zone unless you were backing up another officer. What that had an effect of doing was, if you did consent searches, did any of these other routines, you were only dealing with the demographics of your particular zone. If it was 90% white, your contacts would only be 90% white, 10% black. If it was 90% black, it would be your contacts would be 90% black. It was because of this that the ratio was static and stayed static to the demographics of the city as a whole for quite a while. Now that the Fayetteville Police Department uses not only zones but sectors comprised of 3 zones each, the officers utilize now what's called sector policing. Now they're encouraged to stay within their sector, but they can go out of their zones. They can team up with each other. I could get with Officer Jones and Officer Smith and say, okay, we're going to go to this hotspot. We're going to work on this hotspot and give it concentrated patrol. We're going to saturate it. We're going to try to catch the bad guy. Hotspots are able to be saturated by more than one officer for longer periods of time, as the other officers in the sectors will pick up the calls while you and your buddies did the hotspot, did the search warrants, or did whatever in that area. But now let's look at what happens now with the introduction of crime mapping. Hotspots and how hotspots drive police response to crime. Officers with particular attention to patrol officers and patrol supervisors are ordered to work only the hotspots in the Fayetteville Police Department. That was part of my orders as a supervisor. You didn't just go off and do what you wanted to do. If you were what we refer to as a traffic puppy, you didn't just go off and run radar on Bright Boulevard. If you had free time, if you weren't taking a call, the expectation was that you go and work in your nearest hotspot with somebody else and catch the person doing those crimes, whether they be assaults, primarily breaking and enterings, but assaults or rapes. Rapes was one. That was considered a hotspot up Ramsey Street when they had all those rapes that were going up and down Ramsey Street. In my times with the police department, working the Camden Bureau area, hotspots were regularly at Link Street, School and B in that area, the B Street Initiative, Gibson and Gilmore Street area, Progress and Cooch Street, Tiffany Pines area, Tamarack Apartments area, and sometimes in areas along Hillsborough Street. Only occasionally did I see hotspots pop up along Fort Bragg Road or Stacy Weaver Drive. Utah, Hillendale area, Haymont area, it just wasn't as frequent there. So you had places that come up regularly, and you had places that come up not so often. Now compare the regular areas to the occasional areas, keeping in mind these hotspots are generated by you, the public. Remember, it's based on calls for service. Think about the potentials facing the police, who dedicate any time not spent responding to calls for service in them, who limit their specials to hotspot areas as per standing orders. And if you don't know what a special is, there are times when police squads overlap, their hours overlap. One squad would handle the road, the other squad would do a special. And per order, they would do that special in the hotspots. That means all those officers of that squad would go to that hotspot and work it intensively, saturation patrol. Lost my place here. But remember, race is not a factor. We don't control who calls us. We don't control who calls the police. Sorry, sometimes I refer to it as us. I still have a feeling of a connection with the police department, being retired of it. Even though I'm not sworn anymore, I missed the guess. Now take the next logical step in this thinking process. If there are more police that are devoting more time in areas that have significantly higher black population, said areas determined by computer analysis, hotspots, which are extracted from your input calls for service with no regard for race as a factor, what is the potential for officers conducting a higher percentage of consent searches with persons of color as a result of working in these areas? Answer is very simple, very high. The foremost potential factor facing officers is that their contacts in these areas will be exceedingly high of a person's color. It is this information that the likes of Troy Williams, Alan Rogers, Jeff Thompson have, and they have this information, but do not want to acknowledge. They absolutely fear it, because to understand it and accept it, and accept the validity of it, means that they would have to seek further for answers that would make them very uncomfortable. They are happy to stop short of the causes of the effect that they dislike and demand that we accept answers that we find uncomfortable, and we find it uncomfortable because we know them to be untrue. When faced with the continuing on down the path to seek the truth, they cry foul, they cry racism, and they scramble to try to confuse the main issue. And it's unappreciated. I think we would all like to have an answer as to why the hot spots, which are extracted from calls for service, your input, with no regard to race as a factor, why they do fall predominantly in black areas as opposed to other areas. We would dearly love to have the answer to that, whether it be social, economic reasons, school reasons, whatever the reason are. We would love to solve that one so we can reduce the crime, because that's all our goal. If you look at certain charts, you'll see that total traffic stops versus searches in January to November 2011, we had 51,731 traffic stops. Total searches out of these traffic stops, remember 51,000, only 2,865. 2,000 out of 51,000. Out of that 2,000, only 884 of them were consent searches. Looking at the chart above, it's obvious there's no rampant abuse of consent searches by our Fayetteville law enforcement officers, like some in the community claim. There's your numbers. Let me repeat them again. 51,731. 2,865 total searches. 884 consent searches. Consent searches only occur about 2 to 3% of the time. The extremely low raw numbers and percentage of consent searches shows or tells me that, and other rational-minded citizens, that our Fayetteville Police Department law enforcement officers are using their field expertise and professional discretion before even asking drivers for permission to consent to search their vehicle. The actual facts derived from police departments across the state reflect that the Fayetteville Police Department, with an average of 33% of all searches being consent searches, is a police department that exercises a level of professionalism and expertise above half that of the state. Here's the chart right here for y'all to care to look at it later. This is as a result of excellent training received by the Fayetteville Police Department, and more importantly, the fact that the primary and most vital supervisory aspect of the police department, the sergeants and the lieutenants, relentlessly and professionally ensure that training, rules, and regulations and policies are followed. I know wherefore I speak of because I was a supervisor on the department, and we did relentlessly follow it. Through technological advances, or though technological advances have resulted in more contact with persons of color as response to hotspots and other statistics, a look at the data shows that black drivers and white drivers received citations at nearly the exact same rates. In 2011, blacks received citations at 61.6%. White at 62%. Black drivers and white drivers received warnings at nearly the exact same rate. Blacks at 31.4%, whites at 32.6%. Here are the charts reflecting those. If officers of the Fayetteville Police Department were so intent on abusing blacks, that if there was anywhere that there should have been a discrepancy, this is where the discrepancy should have been. Not in the fact that there were twice as many blacks asked for consent searches as whites, but in the fact that the final punitive action, citations, things like that, it's nearly the same. Where in that can you find intent of racial discrimination or racism? The facts simply do not show it. I myself created a report, a quarterly report, that pulled the data from the computer system at the request of the department command staff. Command staff being that of captains, assistant chiefs, on up. That presented the data by officer, type of arrest, race, sex, both officer and the defendant, so they could review these statistics quarterly and look for any suspicious pattern of racial profiling or racism. This report was specifically requested of me to make for them. This represents an in-depth look at 4 times a year on each and every officer in the department. And I can tell you that if the report was staffed even one day late, I received admonishments for it. I was told to get on it and get on it now. So much so that I created a program to allow them to click of a button to generate the report anytime they wished. I got tired of getting chewed out for it, so I made it easy for them. Here's the button on your desktop. Anytime you click on it, you got up-to-date stats. And they loved it. Supervisory staff at the Fayetteville Police Department takes this responsibility very seriously. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jerry. Okay, next we're going to have Mr. Michael McGinnis address some of the issues with the Noble organization and the PIC in doing that, and some issues that we're dealing with and trying to get more data to go.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here. There's familiar faces going back many years. As I said, I think my first PBA call for duty service occurred because a Fayetteville police officer had the courage to stand up at a press conference just like this to talk about retaliation in the Fayetteville Police Department. And it's been my honor and privilege to have worked with the North Carolina Police Benevolent Association locally and statewide since then. You heard a little bit about the association, and perhaps as the afternoon wears on, we'll talk a little more about it. But I'm here to respectfully suggest to you that the Police Benevolent Association's heart and mind is in the right place on issues of this magnitude. In Tony Schiavone's Fayetteville, citizens must live in a dangerous world of crime without police tools provided by state law. In Tony Schiavone's Fayetteville, law enforcement tools authorized by the legislature and the courts for over 60 years are subject to the whim of local politicians with political agendas. In Tony Schiavone's Fayetteville, the Fayetteville police officers must risk their lives every day on the street to enforce the law and have the mayor order a charge dismissed. In Tony Schiavone's Fayetteville, the law is, as he said the other night, a red herring, if you will, to be skirted and violated at whim. In Tony Schiavone's Fayetteville, the city's own police attorney's legal determination was thrown out in the trash can, in the same trash can that the Legislative Council's legal opinion and that of the North Carolina Chiefs of Police Association. In Tony Schiavone's Fayetteville, law and order continues to erode while political deal-making rips away at the morale and the effectiveness of the Fayetteville Police Department. And Tony Schiavone's view and vision of Fayetteville has brought danger to the city. Not just the danger that police officers encounter when they have to deal with suspects who have Uzis and other high-powered weaponry. What's at stake in Fayetteville is the rule of law. I had the pleasure of being a public official at the local level, state level, and the federal level. And once upon a time as an elected official. And one thing that was drilled in my brain and in my heart was even if I wanted to do something for a political reason that I thought was right, that I was required as a public official to support and defend the Constitution that I swore an oath to. And that, ladies and gentlemen, has been subverted in the city of Fayetteville. I want to speak a bit about an association known as Noble, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Totally unlike years ago when the city of Fayetteville, and there's some folks in the room who have been around for a while. This is not the first rodeo when the city of Fayetteville hired a consultant to examine some aspect of the Fayetteville Police Department. They did it back in the 1990s. And then that city council followed a rational process and considered consulting proposals from various firms who engage in specialized law enforcement consulting. It was done out in the open, ladies and gentlemen. Some of you will remember that. There were debates about it. Which is the most qualified consulting group for this particular task? We had opportunities to weigh in. PBA weighed in. Citizens weighed in. I believe the local chapter of the NAACP weighed in. Now, Mayor Schiavone spoke of transparency the other night. Well, his predecessors back in the 1990s, they believed in that principle when Cheryl Grant was selected, an African-American lawyer and former judge from up in Ohio, to come in and do that study. Now, this year, when it came time for a study, we didn't have transparency. What we had was a backroom deal. What we had was somebody's decision, we don't know who, we didn't know about it until Mr. Iman walked out on January the 23rd and announced that Noble had been selected. No advertising, no opportunity for other groups to submit their qualifications and their proposals. Suggests to me there was a rush to judgment to select Noble. Suggests to me that it was an arbitrary and capricious decision. A little Google search will show you that there are numerous law enforcement consulting agencies around this region and around the country. And they are very important, and they serve very important roles when police departments have problems. Unquestionably, there's some problems here in Fayetteville. I believe not nearly so much in the Fayetteville Police Department as is on the Fayetteville City Council. As Mr. Iman stood at the podium, he knew virtually nothing about the group, that he just came in and told us all that he was hiring to conduct this important study. Didn't seem to know anything about the Noble history. Don't know where he learned that from. There has been a local gentleman publishing op-eds in the Observer who had been alluding to Noble. Maybe that's where they got the idea, maybe not. It is my position that Noble is unqualified to perform the particular functions of this particular consulting assignment. The fundamental reasons for that are as follows. Some of you probably have read Noble's been around since 1976. That suggests they've got some longevity in service of what they do, okay? You can begin a study of Noble, if you will, courtesy of your computer. Pretty simple to do. One of the reporters in the room here, Mr. Barksdale, started research on that, and he found, I believe, 3 projects that Noble had been involved in. And we took advantage of Andrew's work, and we're continuing to run our computers. I'm going to admit to all of you here, our work is far from incomplete. Now, Noble has come and gone. In 4 days, they have apparently done what they believe is sufficient site work to determine something as important as whether there is racial profiling in the Fayetteville Police Department. And ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm here to tell you that that is an absolutely impossible task. You cannot do it in 4 days. I personally have been working on this matter about every day, sometimes 5 to 10 to 12, and some days 20 hours a day for the past 3 or 4 weeks. And I'm not nearly done yet. I'm not ready to give Mr. Midget and the PBA officials the final report. I come from City Hall today obtaining more packets of documents. I'm going to represent to him and the PBA board and to you folks that when my recommendation is given, that it is going to be complete. It's not going to be a rush to judgment, and it's not going to be based in an arbitrary 4-day time period. That is not fair to the Fayetteville Police Department. It's not fair to the City Council. Certainly members on that county or council are eager to learn more. It's not fair to the taxpayers. $30,000 has been dumped into this. Now that sounds like a lot of money. for those of us that don't make too much money. Let me tell you, one of the problems with the project, the research project, is that's much too cheaply. You can't do a serious study of something as important as racial discrimination for $30,000. That's unheard of. Go back and take a look at what Ms. Grant did about 15 years ago. I think it was $55,000 to start. There are people in Fayetteville that believe in their hearts and in their minds that racial profiling exists. You're not going to be able to have an appropriate, complete, and fair determination of that with a $30,000 study after 4 days on the ground. It don't work that way. I have worked with these consulting groups. There's one called PERF that came into Wilmington a few years ago. Had some problems down there. They came in a multiple series of visits. They interviewed all sorts of folks. They interviewed folks out in the community. I don't know exactly what Noble did on the 4 days that they were here. But there's a whole lot of Fayetteville police officers that we're communicating with, the folks that know, the folks that are on the ground, the folks that know what's in their hearts and minds. Noble didn't find too many of them. They're probably going to tell us that they did talk to some police officers. Now there's other problems with Noble. Noble is an advocacy group, and that is fine. Just like the NAACP is a national historical advocacy group, and the PBA is an advocacy group. And I applaud them all for what they do to represent their members and try to advance the cause of justice. But the problem is, ladies and gentlemen, an advocacy group who has already weighed in and made determinations on the narrow issue at hand cannot be an open-minded consultant on a project like we have in the city of Fayetteville. I brought a handful of exhibits over there today. One that I didn't get a copy because it's a 31-page document. I would respectfully urge that all of you find this on the Noble website. It's dated May 3rd, 2001, and it's entitled A Noble Perspective, Racial Profiling, a Symptom of Bias-Based Policing. It is an advocacy memorandum because Noble believes, apparently in its heart and its mind, that, quotes, racial profiling is one of the most critical issues facing law enforcement today. And Noble goes on to say, racial profiling is a national problem. And let me give you just a little bit more from this, but I would implore you to read this, and very carefully. This academic style paper says that Noble's position on racial profiling, its origins and causes, is set forth in this paper, which they're completely entitled to do as an advocacy group. Noble goes on to suggest a definition of racial profiling. And Noble is entitled to its own opinion as to what that term ought to mean. The problem that I have with as a lawyer is it's not the definition that the Supreme Court of the United States has enunciated, okay? And I think we as law-abiding citizens are obliged to respect the authority of our judiciary. And I'm afraid that's a problem in City Hall these days under Mayor Schiavone's thinking, based on what he said the other night about the law being a red herring. I always thought the law was the bottom line, that we have to respect, honor, and obey whether we like it or not. And there's certainly a number of laws enacted in both Raleigh and Washington that I personally believe are not good public policy. I think some are wrong. But Noble takes us down the road of, you see, its vision, its definition of racial profiling. And it goes on, and it turns into discussions of strategy, okay? The decision and public announcement to collect data must be part of an overall strategy, okay? advocacy groups, examples I gave you, they all develop strategy. Now, is it an appropriate thing for an advocacy group to be selected to do a task that it is offering its advice on strategy? The different functions. How do you think the community would react if City Council would have decided, well, we want to appoint PBA to come in and do the consultancy in this case? Don't you know that there would have been a laughing stock kind of reaction? Don't you know that there would have been reasonable questions as to how can a PBA be an open-minded consultant when they're an advocacy group? It goes on and on and on. What you don't see in this academic style paper, you don't see references to the law. You don't see citations to the Supreme Court of the United States that has given us working definitions, and they give us legal tests. How do you go about proving racial profiling? The courts give us those tests. Now, I suggest to you that there's an attorney named Patricia Bradley that knows something about those tests because it's her job. She's a police attorney, and that's a specialized job. And of course, she rendered a legal opinion that ended up in the same trash can with those of others. And that tells us something about respect for the law, which I suggest is a problem in Fayetteville now. In any event, this academic paper goes on and on and on and on with suggestions, ideas, theories, strategy, even gets right down to the nitty-gritty about how to identify officers who display indicators such as high number of citizen complaints. Some of the best law enforcement officers that I have ever had the privilege to have known, generated a lot of citizen complaints. You know why? I'll tell you why. Because they're out there in the damn streets of Fayetteville trying to seriously and aggressively enforce the law. And that will increase complaints. Now, if you park your cruiser up on the top of Haymount Hill up there and kind of sit back there, if you want to be under aggressive, of course you can do that. And that's really not consistent with the oath of office of any sworn law enforcement officer. But in essence, folks, one of the serious problems with Noble on this project is reflected in their own data and what they say about themselves. They've issued other statements. They say that bias-based policing is a systemic problem within law enforcement that must be reformed through comprehensive strategies. Now, that's an area that I, to the very core of my bones, disagree with. I've studied the problem of racial profiling for at least 25 years. I have brought litigation all of my life on behalf of black people. Many of those cases involve claims of race discrimination. I do not claim to be an expert on it. There are people that know far more than me about it, but I know something about it. And what I have learned through consulting with the city of Fayetteville, and I only took them back to 1985, there's been not one single case, not one anywhere, where a Fayetteville Police Department officer has been found liable by a judge or a jury for racial profiling. That is a good record, folks. That is something that for those folks that you live in Fayetteville, you should be proud of that. I'm not suggesting here today that the Fayetteville Police Department is perfect or anywhere near it. And I'm not going to suggest that there are not issues there that need some consideration and some study. But what I'm suggesting to you that I think it is horribly unfair and inappropriate to label an entire police department as being racist when there's never been a judicial finding of that. That's hurtful and it's dangerous. And it's hurting Fayetteville police officers today who are out there keeping the rest of us safe and sound. And they've got these accusations flying around that they're engaging in horrible practices. I've said before, and I'm going to repeat, I personally believe that racial profiling is a horrible offense. And for those who are convicted of that type of offense, or who are found responsible or guilty of that type of offense, I think it's one of those in the category of firing offenses. And for those of you that know me, I've spent my life essentially in employment discrimination cases, and I don't easily jump to the conclusion that something is a firing offense, but I think that racial profiling is. According to the city of Fayetteville, there has been no such finding, no such judgment, no such order, at least since 1985. I wish that I would have asked them back further than that, because that sort of implies that there might have been some before 1985. There is a proper place for Noble to continue to engage in its advocacy, its papers, and its studies, but when there is an issue as important as racial profiling, when they have weighed in as an advocate, developing strategies, it is not the appropriate time for the use of Noble. You ought to be deeply troubled that they've come and gone in 4 days. I'm not suggesting that's their decision. That's in the contract. I want to go back for just a few final words regarding Mayor Schiavone's reasoning and his approach. He was invited here today. We wanted him to be sitting in that chair with us today. We wanted to have this kind of a discussion with him and the city council like PBA has done before. John Midget has gone to the podium before. I've gone to the podium before. We asked for 6 minutes. Why couldn't they see fit to give one side of this dispute 6 minutes? And there's some lurking motive that you need to think about there. They didn't want to hear the other side of this message. There's 2 sides to about every serious fight over public policy. They didn't want the crowd that night to hear the other side of this issue. Many of you were around in the pure scandal known as Ticketgate. I had a hope that we learned something from that. I had a hope that we weren't going to go down that road again of political officials who've got plenty to do, setting budgets, making high-level policy decisions. But there's a clearly defined rule of law that elected officials have no proper place tinkering with law enforcement operations, because it's dangerous. And when you go back and read some history in cities like Chicago and New York, the old style bosses, where corruption was rampant, it often happened because certain people were able to get to mayors and council members, and then they whisper in the ear of a police sergeant over here that, you know, that house, let's steer clear. That's what corruption is all about. And I thought and hoped and believed that everybody learned a lesson from Ticketgate. Well, guess what, folks? We didn't. Because here we are again, and it's a whole lot worse than it was during Ticketgate. That made the city of Fayetteville and all of the good things going on here, and there are some good things going on here, an embarrassment then, and it's come back again today. But this time the reach of the obstruction is far greater, because every time there's a traffic stop, and you folks have heard the data, and this very fine police officer here who's now continuing to work with his brothers and sisters, take a look at that data. Examine this very, very, very carefully before you go drawing conclusions on a very difficult emotional issue. But if a consent search process that's been used for over 60 years, and there's never been a legal problem with it here, when that is eliminated, it eliminates the ability of Fayetteville police officers to protect themselves out there in the most difficult environment, in the difficult circumstances that police officers have to try to survive in. And the mayor's policy, which is now the city's policy as a result of this moratorium, stands in the way of the rule of law. And that's dangerous. And it sends every kind of an absolutely inappropriate message, not just to the police community, but to the entire community. I've got some limited copies of some of the data related to Noble. Be happy to share that with you. I hope that all of you that have come here today, and I thank you all for coming, there's other places that you could have been, I hope that you will seriously consider this. I hope that some of you would even consider talking to some members of City Council and see if they want to reconsider before this situation gets even more dangerous and more difficult for everybody here. It's at the point of a threshold that there is now likely going to have to be the initiation of legal proceedings, and we know where that's going to take us. $30,000 won't even be the down payment. Apparently the mayor's got a view that that sort of doesn't matter. He wants to dive into it. And I simply believe that that is irresponsible leadership and irresponsible decision-making when the overwhelming wealth of legal authority that's weighed in on this, including the Fayetteville police attorney, all of that's being put in the trash can for some reason that I believe is inherently political. Mr. Mitchell?
Hey, Mike, are we able to ask you questions now?
Well, we're going to do that at the end. I think it's done.
Yes, and that gets to, you know, where we go from here. Thank you, Mike, for that. And, you know, somebody asked me the other day at the city council meeting, are we going to sue, or, you know, something about litigation. And, you know, what startled me was what the mayor said in terms of basically bring it on, will be the test case. You know, this is the citizens' money. It's not their money. These are tax dollars we're talking about. And I guess it would help to carry the dialogue and sell more papers and put more talk show presentations together, that we would talk about this until our heads explode. But with everything going on in the city of Fayetteville, and what I've heard about from a lot of folks is this the only thing to talk about? We've talked about this and talked it to death, or you know, where will this end? Well, if it ends in an arena where we're spending thousands of taxpayer dollars to fight something that is already decided by the law. The Supreme Court has already decided this issue. The law of the land has decided this issue. Our Constitution has decided this issue. And the people in authority by the District Attorney's Office and the State Attorney General and the U.S. Attorney have decided this issue. But yet we're going to spend more money, apparently, in some legal process that is supposed to be spun as some kind of positive process. That is not positive. So what we are going to be looking at, there is an ethics commission, and we will have questions after that, but narrowly and specifically, PBA is planning to file a complaint with the Ethics Commission for the City of Fayetteville. We are still gathering data as far as what other legal action we're going to take. We're still gathering lots of information, as Mr. McGinnis alluded to. We've just got some more today, and we're going to look at that because unlike other situations, we are going to do a full study of this before we just jump into trying to get in a legal battle and getting into some contest with the city about it. And thirdly, we are going to look to our elected leaders. We are very disappointed, to say the least, that our district attorney has made the decision that he's not going to look into this. We are perplexed. We do know that the Attorney General has been asked to look into the standards and training issues with the very legitimate concerns of the police chief and all the officers of Fayetteville. And we will vigorously represent any of our members who are sanctioned or fired or brought into a negative light because they are enforcing the laws as part of their duty of office. So all of that is going to be in the process, but I will say to you what we want to do is we are still hoping and are here to discuss these matters because, again, the council can certainly look into these matters in an appropriate way. Voting collectively to disrespect the law, to set aside the law, to say that the law doesn't matter, is something that is should not just happen in Fayetteville. It should not happen anywhere in this country. And I'll say one more thing. This is the city with the largest military base of operation in the United States and in the free world. We are sending young men and women off to foreign lands to fight for positions, for laws, for a process that we're denying to our own police officers and our own citizens here in Fayetteville. It's the most astounding irony I think I've ever dealt with in 35 years of doing this business. 2 of my 3 sons are out there right now. They're law enforcement officers. And if the third one becomes an officer, my 33-year marriage, I've been told, is on the rocks. My wife has let it be known. This is a tough job. But we have officers out there, and I remind you, men, women, African American, white, Hispanic. Our chapter president is a Cuban American of this local chapter. We're all in this together, and we all want to do the right thing. If we have an officer out there doing what has been accused here, that must be stopped. We all have to be united to do that. But there's a right way to do that. And if we forego the rule of law, we are not even doing what our basis of our whole institution and our country is all about. So with that said, if you guys want to join me up here, we'll be glad to answer any question you have. Thank you for your patience. You've been very cordial, and I really appreciate it. Yes, Ann?
So when do you expect to file the ethics complaint? This week?
A week, 10 days.
And when do you think your final report to him will be? I guess your report will list various legal recommendations. When do you think that report will be done, roughly?
Andrew, it's a fair question, but it's a hard one to answer because
Mike, you want to step up here?
yeah, we're still getting leads. I mean, I took off Saturday night, and I came to Fayetteville and had a nice dinner out at Chris's Steakhouse, and I ran into a delightful husband and wife, African Americans, that stopped me in the parking lot, and I thought it was going to be an uncomfortable exchange. And
why would you say that?
It's because how they approached me and the demeanor. It looked like that they were expressing some discomfort, and they came over and identified themselves, and they were completely appropriate, and they left me with a message.
So you prejudged them?
No, I did not prejudge them.
If you
I evaluated their behavior, sir, based on how they approached me. It had nothing to do with their race or color.
right, I'm not.
Yeah.
I didn't say anything about their race.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that at all.
It was 2 individuals walking. It was a little bit too rapid for me under those circumstances, and I thought I was being approached. And they were completely appropriate. Didn't know me, had heard about me, and quite frankly, encouraged me to stand up and fight for the Fayetteville Police Department. That these 2 individuals apparently had a lot of confidence in the police department. Apparently, according to them, the police department's had a good, solid history in recent years. Not perfect, but it was a nice thing for me to hear after a week of about 60 hours on the clock trying to address these sorts of issues. That's just one example.
So Mike, your answer is you don't know when you'll finish your report. Do you expect it will be before the March 12th or March 13th, whatever the date is, for them to complete the review?
I sure hope so. I sure hope so.
Can I elaborate again on what you just said? I just want to
Sure.
give you a perspective. I'm not a politician. I don't work for the radio station, although you might think because I'm sitting in this corner that I do. I'm not pushing to have this agenda work and go any further than it's been going. I think it's been going on 12, 13, 14, 15 months, way too long. I am a citizen. I am a concerned citizen. I'm 42 years old. I have 4 kids. I'm married, and I consider myself a decent human being. But the whole thing of what you just said, you went, you had a delightful dinner, you left, you walked out into the parking lot, African-American couple just walked up out of nowhere. You didn't have to know that they were African-American. The fact that they know you and you don't know them, but everything that came from them was complimentary and cordial, you prejudged them. Now,
No, I just absolutely did not.
Just let me finish what I'm trying to say. This is what I'm, this
The
is the point.
mannerism that they approached me suggests, sir, that they weren't happy with me.
Okay, so the problem that the citizens have
Sure.
with the consent searches and the stops is that if I'm driving and I'm minding my business, and an officer gets behind me, I don't know that my tail light is out. I don't know that my license plate light is out, because that's not something that we normally check when we get in our cars and after. And he stopped me because of that. When he walks up to my car, and my demeanor is, I don't know what I did, what did you stop me for?
Sure.
His judgment call, and I understand where you're coming from, because I know what you're getting ready to say. His judgment call is to protect himself because of my demeanor. My demeanor is, I haven't done anything. But I could be the nicest person in the world.
But you are.
And if they go beyond that, beyond me being the nicest person in the world because I want to know why I got stopped, which is a fair question. And instead of him stopping me initially for what he was going to do in the beginning, because I said to him in a manner that he didn't find cool at the time, he wants to go the extra step and search my car. Now, I haven't said anything about race at all. What I'm trying to say, and what I've been saying ever since the very first meeting in November of 2010, when the data first came out, and this gentleman sat here and talked about the data from January of 2011 up to this point, which totally erodes why we even got into this mess. Why he even brought that up, I don't know. But that came up. And what I've been saying from the very first beginning is, if you accept the fact that people have a problem with it, if you accept the fact that something has to be done, don't be so defensive about people not looking at, the people looking at these numbers and wondering why they are. If Chief Bergemeyer would have came out and said that this is an issue, I understand that you think it's an issue, and we're gonna try to address this issue to correct this issue, we wouldn't have all this mess. I have a problem. Just please let me finish. Just please
Okay, I
let me
want to answer something.
I'd love to just sit down with you guys for about 30 minutes to give you a different perspective, because I hear your perspective and I respect your perspective. I've been through all kinds of things with police officers. I don't have no problem with you guys, but I've been slammed on my hood 3 times for nothing. I've been pulled over for nothing. I've been beat up in Virginia Beach by police officers who I didn't know for nothing. But at the same time, I've never, ever wanted to retaliate. I've had my car searched, all kinds of things. But I don't have a problem with you guys. But I know that my position is exceptional. That's not normal. And what I'm telling you is the perception of the citizens in this city, from an African-American standpoint, is that you don't care. Now, is that unfair? Yes. Let me finish. Yes. But at the same time, that's how they feel. So to stand here and say things like, let me see, I got plenty of notes over here, that the Noble Group is an advocacy group, and that they're doing only what they advocate. If the PBA would have been hired and they're an advocacy group for the police department, yeah, the people would have been up in arms for that too. So I understand what you're coming from, but it's a two-sided thing. So instead of standing here telling us how great the police department is, which it's not, because everybody has flaws, and instead of standing here and trying to act like, Alan Rogers and Jeff here created a problem just to have a political or economic agenda, to say those things let me know even furthermore that you just don't care. All you want to do is be defensive of how dare people question us, putting our life on the line, going out here for us citizens. How dare we question you who's supposed to be out here doing something for us? How many times as an officer have you ever helped anybody that ran out of
You've
gas?
asked a lot of questions. Can I answer any part of these questions?
Can you answer this right here? How many times have you ever helped a gentleman in distress?
Well, let me,
John.
let me just say this.
John,
Let me
we've got
say
some
this one thing,
deadlines.
Bill. Let me just say this, with everything you're feeling and you're saying, what I would like to say to that, and what we really have to get to is press conference standpoint, but you brought up these issues and you deserve an answer. I'm not saying any of that isn't genuinely what you feel, but that does never, it never gives anyone in this room the right to set aside the law. And that's what we're talking about here. The moratorium stops all officers from doing
Laws
that,
have
not
been-
just the ones
laws
that
have
may
been
be
changed
involved.
since 1776.
Sir,
So-
that's all I can,
So we
that's
can make
really all we
adjustments
can
to
talk.
laws to support the democracy.
If we wanna go to the
of our
General
citizens.
Assembly and change that, that's what we do here too. We lobby for laws that improve the system. But as long as the law is the law, to set aside that law, that's the standard by which we're objecting
Well,
here.
maybe this is just the beginning of changing the law.
Well, it could be, and that would be another argument, and we would welcome that opportunity for that kind of dialogue. Bill first, and then.
I was just gonna, you have no issue with the fact that there would be reasonable address, 2 and 3 motors stopped. You have no issue with anybody, Troy Williams, anybody who would ask that question. I'd ask the same question too if I were black. Your real issue here, if I'm correct, is that you think that the city, in other words, my question is this, could they have done this without the moratorium? Would you be supportive?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, without a problem. And I think that's, the city council has terrific guidelines and statutory authority to do just that. Yes, sir. Yes.
You
I'm
mentioned-
sorry, Mark.
Yeah, you go ahead, Myron.
Sorry.
Just to clarify, so you would support a review